The rock and roll years, from the early 1960s through to the late 80s, we lived through an explosion of pop culture such as the world has never seen. And it wasn't just America and Europe, it was everywhere. Kids in the rest of the world had their own pop music, fashion, and movies. This series tells their story. Today, music. When most people think about when rock and roll first took off, they think of the music I listened to as a kid in New Jersey. Elvis Presley, Bill Haley, Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly, and Fats Domino. But rock and roll was a much bigger explosion than that. It erupted all over the globe, from Moscow to Hong Kong, and from Kinshasa to Mexico City. But I'm going to introduce you to some rock and roll pioneers you might not have heard of. Not only did they rock to the same stuff I did, but they listened to their own music too. They mixed it all up and came up with new sounds that still influence us today. From the earliest days of rock and roll, it became clear that once people got a taste of this spirit of freedom, they would do anything to hold on to it. But not all musicians had it so easy. By the mid-60s, things would change for the worse. Did you know that there was even a place where an X-ray was the only way to hear a top 40 hit? We musicians like to think of ourselves as rock and roll rebels, and a lot of rockers are political. But even the most hardcore punks in New York and London had it pretty easy. Nobody was going to throw us in prison for our music. But in a lot of the world, being a rocker was a risky business. Strangely enough, it didn't matter if your government was a right-wing military junta in South America or communists in Russia. They didn't like rock. I mean, even buying a record in Russia in the 60s could get you arrested. The only place to get a rock record was on the black market. The rock and roll black marketers were nothing if not ingenious. This rarely seen film footage shows what many Russians called rock on bones, black market records pressed on used X-rays from a hospital. Film director Konstantin Osin remembers how he'd risk a one-way ticket to Siberia every time he bought one.
Приходили на рынок и говорили, что у вас есть.
You just came to the market and asked, what have you got? The seller looked around to check if there were police or voluntary guards of public order around and put on the original record.
The records were all homemade and illegal. If you got caught with one, the penalty was 8 years in prison.
Дырка проделалась кустарная.
There was a hole in the middle made by hand. The record played with difficulty because it was warped, but you could put a weight on top of it and it revolved. And the needle, with a whizzing noise, was producing this famous, beautiful music that all young people went crazy about. Rock and roll had finally come.
Lover's hunch turned out to be right. The popularity of his band soared. Over time, rockers all over the world realized they needed to sing in their own language. Local bands suddenly became more popular in their own countries. With popularity came the power to influence opinion, and power was dangerous. In the late 80s, I remember how we suddenly began hearing about a funny word out of Russia, glasnost. Punk and new wave were winding down in the West, but in the East, the doors were opening to a whole set of new freedoms, including the freedom to rock. Finally, 25 years after rock and roll had first been danced in the USSR, Soviet rockers could move out of the underground. This is Leningrad in 1986. In the evil empire, it was suddenly legal to be cool.